Next, from Phase 2 of the International Citizens Inquiry into 9/11, Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Canadian Action Party, Ken Fernandez, 9/11 and Canada, a case study in Takeover.
The theme of the presentation is 9/11 in Canada, a case study in Takeover. I would like to give a little overview of the U.S. government's strategic global objectives that have been roundly enunciated many times over, so I do not need to bore you with where the sources are because they have been reiterated here and in many other places, including mainstream press. One of the key objectives, as we have seen, is a control over energy. We not only see that with respect to 9/11, we saw it also in the attempts to unseat President Chavez in Venezuela a couple of years ago. We've seen that in the ongoing civil carnage that's being wrought upon Colombia as we speak. We're seeing that in Nigeria. We saw that in Yugoslavia, and I'll touch on those areas a little later. The other aspect that was very interesting to note was that the arms spending that took place in the aftermath of 9/11 appears to have staved off, at least temporarily, a stock market collapse. And then there was the sowing of fear among the masses. Concomitant with that was the clamping down of civil liberties. We saw the constant mention of bin Laden and the fear that bin Laden and his terrorists were doing such and such thing. And then there was the anthrax scare. Then there was the power blackout. There was code red, code orange. There was duct tape scare where duct tape ran out in many parts of the U.S. because Tom Ridge decided to frighten the public with imminent attacks of anthrax and God knows what else. We've seen the Patriot Act, where the government then becomes all-seeing. We've seen other countries accept de facto U.S. control. Indonesia, which was already somewhat under that yoke. India, many Middle Eastern countries that were then induced to have U.S. advisors go in and help them out. So Canada was no different. The strategic objective of hemming in Russia to preempt a sort of resurgence of a modified USSR. Also to preempt China from becoming expansionist or at least from being able to threaten the United States' hegemony in any major way. The advance of the drug trade. In the aftermath of the relentless bombing campaign of Afghanistan, there's been a resurgence in the poppy trade in that country and therefore in the opium and heroin trades. And lastly, but by no means the least, one of the prime strategic objectives I would submit to you of the US policy planning was the absorption of Canada. Because Canada is a rich treasure trove of energy supplies, water, gold, steel, oil, etc., 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 all of which have been highly coveted by the coterie that has been ruling the United States for quite a long time. And indeed, Canada's historical importance, strategic importance, should not be underestimated. I mean, from the outset of the United States, it was the manifest destiny put forward by the American founding fathers to establish a hegemony over the entire hemisphere, and in particular, British North America, now known as Canada. Of course, the project for the new American century serves to underscore that, though it doesn't mention Canada specifically. But if we go into the historical record from the time that Brian Mulroney took office, or a little bit before that, we go back to 1981, you will see an attempt to secure the oil reserves of Canada by way of an intense propaganda campaign against Trudeau's national energy policy, which would have given Canada control over its own energy and oil supplies by design, and would have been the precursor to a national industrial policy which to this day Canada lacks. Big oil, in particular Exxon Corporation via its affiliate Esso, which provided generous financing to the Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed, encouraged Lougheed to play the card of Western alienation. So the focus shifted from ownership of our own oil reserves to these evil people in Toronto and Montreal who dominate federal parliament, dominate cabinets in Trudeau's government, that are making decisions without consulting we, the poor people in the West, whose oil it is. And then there was the bumper sticker campaign, let those Eastern bastards freeze, and so on. That was all financed by big oil. So that was the backdrop. And then at the same time, you saw maneuvers by big business interests to put forward Mulroney. It's interesting to note that Mulroney, as Conservative leader and later Prime Minister, prior to that, Mulroney had served as the president of Iron Ore Corporation, which was a subsidiary of Hana Mining. Hana Mining played a leading role in bringing about the coup d'etat in Brazil in 1964, which, by virtue of which a very violent dictatorship was installed, a military government. Disappearance, torture, kidnappings, etc., were quite routine and widespread. But the concern in that instance was steel and how much was going to be paid for steel, and would Brazil have control over its steel? Well, the same thing with Canada. And because Mulroney successfully shielded Bechtel Corporation some years before from exposure during a commission of inquiry into unusual events that took place in Quebec, he was drawn to the attention of Hana Mining. So they realized then that he was quite compliant and willing to abide by their whims and fancies, and therefore they played leading roles in supporting him. At the same time, as Mulroney was being brought forward, and as the energy policy was being implemented, the Quebec separatism hit its fevered pitch. And therefore, that push to try and play the divide and rule card. And it's interesting to note that according to David Orchard in his book, The Fight for Canada, Alan McEachen and Trudeau were actually threatened by United States officials who said to him, well, if you want to go ahead with the national industrial policy, we'll simply destabilize your country via Quebec and Ontario. And so it's interesting to note the timings. But critical to all that was the role of the media. The Canadian media has been faithfully reporting a certain slant. And in the 70s, when Vernon Walters was director of plans for the CIA, according to the book by Marcy McDonald, Yankee Doodle Dandy, he wrote a memo to George Bush Sr., then CIA director, in which he said, we must take over the media of a targeted nation. And so you had the unusual instances of, like, the Montreal Star, where a prolonged strike of its printers shut it down. Montreal Star was routinely exposed CIA activities around the globe. It was shut down, and we have now the Montreal Gazette, which is not much better than the National Post. The push for the American party line is very, very consistent. As a general rule, there are some notable exceptions, the Toronto Star, the Fifth Estate, and so on. But as a general rule, we don't hear about torture in Iraq. We hear about abuses of Iraqi prisoners. No investigation has been made as to the fact that the U.S. Army runs torture schools at the School of the Americas, now known as Western Hemispheric Institute for Security Cooperation. There is no mention of torture being taught at Fort Bragg in North Carolina either. Simply put, this is presented in exactly the way Washington wishes it to be presented, an isolated incident made by quote-unquote rogue elements. The notion of rogue state, routinely touted by the Canadian media, without really discussing what constitutes rogue and why they're rogue states, but they're rogue states because Washington says they are. But that is not brought forward into the public discourse or into the public record. The fact that there is no possible link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein because one was fanatically opposed to the fundamentalism espoused by the other. That was not brought forward, in fact shielded. The point of Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein being linked was in fact advanced by people such as Rex Murphy, who was advocating that George Bush was well within his rights to attack Iraq if he sensed the threat. The positioning of the Canadian public via the media to agree with the need for controls on our civil liberties, with the need for our government to go in lockstep with Washington, was such that at this point, the media, together with our government, has not made any distinction between American security interests and Canadian security interests. In point of fact, the government of Canada today is quite content with the notion that the entire globe is one vast series of U.S. zones of U.S. interest. And I can say this from personal experience because I attended a conference at which Janet Bax spoke.